Daddy always said, "When God's creatures come calling, you best listen." But I never figured he'd send a bobcat to deliver the message. Highway 287 stretched like a ribbon through the Texas heat, but today, something had brought traffic to a dead stop. Officer Jackson Crow Feather squinted through his windshield at the commotion ahead. Cars backed up for miles, folks standing outside their vehicles, all staring at something in the road. A bobcat, not much bigger than a house cat, sitting dead center in the passing lane like she owned the place. But this wasn't no ordinary wild animal behavior. This little mama was looking right at people, making eye contact, and every time someone tried to shoo her away, she'd cry out like her heart was breaking. Jackson stepped out of his cruiser, and that's when he saw it, something metal glinting on her hind leg. A device of some kind, with letters he could barely make out. Help, TU 1952. The bobcat looked straight at him, turned toward the forest and waited. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Central, this is Unit 247, Jackson spoke into his radio, never taking his eyes off the bobcat. I'm going to need wildlife services out here, and you might want to put search and rescue on standby. The little cat hadn't moved an inch, just sat there watching him with those amber eyes, like she was waiting for him to figure something out. Jackson had seen plenty of wildlife in his 20 years on the force, but nothing like this. This wasn't fear or confusion. This was purpose. Dr. Sarah Thunder Cloud arrived within the hour, her white pickup kicking up dust as she pulled alongside the growing crowd of onlookers. Sarah had been working with Texas wildlife for over 2 decades, and Jackson trusted her judgment more than any textbook. "Never seen anything like it," she murmured, kneeling about 10 feet from the bobcat. "Look at her behavior, Jackson. She's not acting territorial or defensive. She's communicating." Sarah's weathered hands worked quickly, pulling out her tablet to check the device's identification number. TW 1952, Thomas Walking Bear, 68 years old. Reported missing by his landlord yesterday morning when he didn't return from a photography expedition. Jackson felt something cold settle in his stomach at the name, but he kept his expression neutral. Walking Bear. That name stirred memories he'd buried deep. How long can someone survive out there in this heat? Jackson asked, though he already knew the answer. 72 hours, maybe less, depending on shelter and water, Sarah replied grimly. And Jackson, there's something else. This bobcat. She's heavily pregnant. Should be denning up, not traveling miles through dangerous territory. The bobcat suddenly stood, took a few steps toward the tree line, then looked back at them. The message was clear as day. "My grandfather used to say, 'Animals don't lie,'" Sarah said quietly. "When they ask for help, someone's dying." Jackson's partner, Deputy Mike Stone, had arrived and was shaking his head at the whole situation. "Come on, Jackson. We're talking about following a wild animal into rough country based on what? A hunch?" But Jackson was watching the bobcat's eyes, seeing something there that reminded him of every mother he'd ever seen begging for help to save her child. Only this mother was trying to save someone else entirely. "Standard protocol says we wait for the full search team," Mike continued. "Could be another 6 hours before they get organized." The bobcat made a sound then, not quite a meow, not quite a growl, pure desperation. Her sides were visibly swollen with pregnancy, and Jackson could see dried blood on her paws from the rough journey. "Sarah," Jackson said slowly, "how long before she can't travel anymore?" "Not long." "She's already pushing herself beyond what's safe." Jackson looked at the forest, then back at the small creature who'd somehow made it her mission to save a human life. Sometimes you had to trust your gut even when it didn't make sense to anybody else. "Mike, radio dispatch. Tell them we're going in." The name Walking Bear hit Jackson like a punch to the gut, dragging him back 23 years to a memory he'd spent decades trying to forget. He was 25 again, standing in the kitchen of their small house on the reservation, watching his pregnant wife Maria stir a pot of stew while his father packed his old duffel bag. "You can't just walk away from family, Dad," Jackson had shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "Maria's due in 2 months. Your grandchild needs you here." Thomas Walking Bear had looked up from his packing, those same dark eyes that Jackson saw in the mirror every morning. "Sometimes a man has to lose himself to find his purpose, son. The spirits are calling me on a vision quest, and I can't ignore that call." "Vision quest?" Jackson had laughed bitterly. "That's what you're calling running away now? What about your purpose here?" "What about us?" Maria had set down her wooden spoon and turned to face her father-in-law, her hand resting protectively on her swollen belly. "Thomas, please. We need you. Jackson needs you." But Thomas had just shaken his head, shouldering his bag. "The old ways are calling me back to the mountains. I need to understand my place in the great circle before I can be any good to this family." Jackson remembered the sound of the screen door slamming, the rumble of his father's old pickup truck starting up, the way Maria had collapsed into his arms crying. He'd held her tight, feeling the baby kick against his chest, and made a promise that burned in his throat. "I'll never abandon my family like he did. Never." But life had a way of making liars out of good intentions. Fast forward. 18 years, and Jackson found himself working double shifts, chasing overtime pay, trying to make sergeant while his son Danny played football and dated girls and grew up mostly without him. Just like his father, Jackson had told himself he was doing it for the family. Just like his father, he'd been wrong. The night Danny died, Jackson was supposed to pick him up from a party. Supposed to be there at 11 sharp, but a domestic violence call had run long, and Jackson had sent a text. "Get a ride with Tommy. Working late again." Danny had tried calling twice. Jackson had let it go to voicemail, too focused on paperwork to answer. By the time he'd listened to the messages, "Dad, Tommy's drunk and everyone else left. Can you please come get me?" It was too late. Danny had tried to walk the 6 miles home in the dark along a country road with no shoulders. The semi-driver never saw him. Jackson had arrived at the hospital to find his son's broken body on a gurney, Maria sobbing in the hallway, and his own reflection in the window looking exactly like his father had that night he'd walked out. Absent when it mattered most. "The spirits will guide us back together when the time is right," Thomas had said as he'd climbed into his truck. 23 years later, Jackson finally understood what his father had meant. They were both men who'd let fear drive them away from the people they loved most. Thomas had been afraid of becoming a burden, afraid of losing himself to age and tradition. Jackson had been afraid of not providing enough, afraid of not being successful enough to be worthy of his family's love. In the end, they'd both lost everything they were trying to protect. The divorce papers had been finalized 6 months after Danny's funeral. Maria couldn't stand to look at him anymore. Couldn't forgive him for choosing work over family one too many times. Jackson didn't blame her. He'd changed his name from Walking Bear to Crow Feather the day the papers were signed, desperate to distance himself from the legacy of abandonment his father had left him. But standing on Highway 287, watching a pregnant bobcat risk everything to save someone she loved, Jackson realized something that cut him to the bone. His father hadn't been a coward who'd run away. He'd been a man carrying pain so deep he thought staying would poison everyone around him. Just like Jackson had poisoned his own marriage with guilt and overtime and the desperate need to prove he wasn't his father's son. The irony was bitter as desert wind. In trying so hard not to become Thomas Walking Bear, Jackson had become exactly what he'd feared, a man who abandoned his family when they needed him most. Different reasons, same result. Danny was dead, Maria was gone, and Jackson had spent 2 years drowning in a bottle, wondering if his father had felt this same crushing weight of regret. Now, 23 years after Thomas had disappeared into the mountains seeking redemption, fate had sent a desperate animal to bring them together. If the old man was really out there in those canyons, if he was hurt or dying, then this was Jackson's chance to break the cycle, his chance to choose family over fear, love over pride, his chance to finally understand what his father had been trying to teach him about the great circle of life, that sometimes you had to lose everything to find what really mattered. Jackson looked at the bobcat, waiting patiently for him to make a decision, and heard his father's voice from that long-ago night. "The spirits will guide us back together when the time is right." Maybe they already had. Jackson made his decision with the kind of certainty that comes from 20 years of police work and a lifetime of regret. "Sarah, Mike, we're following her. Now." Mike shook his head, frustration clear on his weathered face. "Jackson, this is crazy. We should wait for the full search team, proper equipment, helicopters. Following a wild animal into rough country based on a hunch, that's not police work, that's a suicide mission." But Jackson was already checking his gear, adjusting his utility belt. "Sometimes police work means trusting your gut, Mike. And my gut's telling me we don't have time to wait." Sarah was nodding in agreement, shouldering her veterinary pack. "The bobcat's behavior is unprecedented, but it's clear. She's been traveling for hours, maybe days, and she's close to her physical limit. If she's trying to lead us to someone, it has to be urgent." The bobcat. Jackson found himself thinking of her as Ayanna, though he wasn't sure why the Cherokee word for eternal blossom came to mind, had moved to the edge of the forest. She paused every few steps, looking back to ensure they were following, her amber eyes reflecting an intelligence that made Jackson's skin prickle. They entered the tree line as the afternoon sun began its descent toward the western horizon. The temperature was still brutal, hovering near 95 degrees, and Jackson could feel sweat already soaking through his uniform shirt. The terrain was rough, loose limestone, scattered oak, and thick underbrush that caught at their boots with every step. Ayanna moved with surprising grace despite her condition, following what appeared to be an old deer trail that wound deeper into the canyon country. Every 100 yards or so she would stop and wait, sometimes making that same desperate crying sound that had first caught Jackson's attention on the highway. "Look at this," Sarah said, kneeling beside a cluster of broken branches. "These weren't broken by deer or other wildlife. Someone came through here recently, probably within the last day or two." Jackson studied the disturbed vegetation, his training kicking in. Heavy footsteps, uneven gait. Someone was carrying a lot of gear, or they were injured. They found the campsite after another hour of difficult hiking. It was tucked into a small clearing beside a seasonal creek bed, now dry except for a few stagnant pools. Professional photography equipment was scattered around. Tripods, camera cases, telephoto lenses worth thousands of dollars. But what caught Jackson's attention was the camera case lying open beside a cold fire pit. The label read, "T. Walking Bear, Wildlife Photography." Jackson felt his knees go weak. After 23 years of wondering, of anger, of carefully buried hope, here was proof that his father was not only alive, but had been working just hours from where Jackson lived and worked every day. "You know this guy?" Mike asked, noting Jackson's reaction. "Yeah," Jackson said quietly. "I know him." Sarah was examining the abandoned gear with professional interest. "Look at these photos," she said, scrolling through the digital camera's memory. "He's been documenting a bobcat family. Look, there's our girl, and there's her mate." Jackson looked over Sarah's shoulder at the camera's LCD screen. The photos showed Ayanna and a larger male bobcat in various poses around what appeared to be a den site. But as Sarah scrolled through the images, Jackson noticed something that made his blood run cold. The most recent photos showed only Ayanna, alone and obviously distressed. "Where's the male?" Jackson asked. "Unknown," Sarah replied grimly. "But based on Ayanna's behavior and these photos, I'd say something happened to him recently. That's probably why she's so desperate. She's not just trying to save Thomas, she's protecting the only friend she has left." Ayanna had moved to the far edge of the clearing and was pacing restlessly, occasionally looking toward a gap in the trees that led to even rougher terrain. Her sides were visibly swollen with pregnancy, and Jackson could see she was breathing hard from the exertion. "She's been going back and forth," Sarah observed. "Look at the wear patterns in the vegetation. She's been making this trip multiple times, probably bringing him water." The thought of his father lying injured somewhere in this unforgiving landscape, being kept alive by a pregnant bobcat's determination, hit Jackson like a physical blow. How long had the old man been out here? What had driven him to this remote place? And why did Jackson feel like this moment had been inevitable, like all the anger and hurt of the past 23 years had been leading to this exact point? They found blood on the rocks where Ayanna was pacing, not much but enough to confirm that she was pushing herself beyond safe limits. The drops led toward a steep descent into what looked like a deep canyon system. "That's Badlands down there," Mike said, peering over the edge. "Flash flood country. If he's down in those canyons and a storm hits, then we better find him before that happens," Jackson said, checking his radio. No signal this deep in the wilderness. They were on their own. Sarah was examining Ayanna's condition with growing concern. "She's starting early labor," she announced. "The stress and exertion are triggering contractions. We need to get her to safety soon, or we're going to lose both her and the cubs." But Ayanna wasn't interested in safety. She was moving toward the canyon edge, looking back at them with eyes that seemed to plead for understanding. Down there, in that maze of stone and shadow, Thomas Walking Bear was waiting. And time was running out for all of them. "Daddy always taught me to read the land," Jackson said, more to himself than the others. "Said the earth would tell you everything you needed to know if you just paid attention." He studied the canyon walls, the way the shadows fell, the patterns of erosion. Somewhere down there was his father, the man who'd taught him to track, to read sign, to understand the language of the wilderness, the man who'd walked away when Jackson needed him most, and who now needed Jackson more than he'd ever needed anyone. Jackson shouldered his pack and started toward the canyon edge. "Come on," he called to the others. "Let's go bring him home." The descent into the canyon was treacherous, a maze of loose limestone and jagged outcroppings that seemed determined to send them tumbling into the depths below. Jackson led the way, following Ayanna's careful path as she picked her route with the precision of someone who'd made this journey many times before. The pregnant bobcat moved slowly now, pausing frequently as contractions rippled through her swollen sides. "Easy, girl," Sarah whispered, staying close behind the laboring animal. "We're almost there." The canyon walls rose around them like cathedral spires, blocking out most of the late afternoon sun and creating an eerie twilight even though it was barely past 6 o'clock. The air was cooler here, trapped between the stone walls. But Jackson could smell something that made his police instincts flare, the metallic scent of blood, and underneath it, the sour smell of infection. They'd been descending for nearly an hour when they heard it, a voice, weak and distant, echoing off the canyon walls. "Help! Somebody! Please!" Jackson's heart hammered against his ribs. 23 years of silence, and now his father's voice reaching out from the shadows like a ghost from his past. He quickened his pace, scrambling over loose rocks, ignoring the way sharp edges tore at his uniform. "Dad?" Jackson called out, his voice cracking like a teenager's. "Dad, is that you? Jackson?" The response was immediate, filled with disbelief and desperate hope. "Son, is that really you?" They found Thomas Walking Bear trapped beneath a fallen boulder at the bottom of a narrow ravine, his right leg pinned from the knee down. The old man looked exactly like Jackson remembered, but weathered by 2 decades of hard living, his black hair now streaked with silver, his face deeply lined, but those dark eyes still sharp with intelligence and pain. "Jesus, Dad," Jackson breathed, dropping to his knees beside his father. "How long have you been down here?" "2 days," Thomas gasped, his voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe 3. Hard to keep track when you're seeing things that ain't there." Sarah immediately began her medical assessment while Mike started examining the boulder, looking for ways to safely move it. But Jackson couldn't take his eyes off his father's face. The face that had haunted his dreams and his nightmares for more than 2 decades. "I came back to find you," Thomas said, his words slurred with dehydration and pain. "Heard about Danny. Heard about the divorce. Came back to tell you I was sorry." The words hit Jackson like a physical blow. "You knew about Danny?" "Been keeping track," Thomas admitted, tears cutting tracks through the dirt on his weathered cheeks. "Been too ashamed to reach out, but I never stopped caring." "Never stopped wondering if my boy was okay." Jackson felt 23 years of carefully controlled anger threaten to explode out of him. "You son of a bitch," he whispered. "You knew Danny died and you didn't come. You knew Maria left me and you didn't—" "Jackson," Sarah's voice cut through his rising fury. "Look at Ayanna." The Bobcat had collapsed beside Thomas, her labor advancing rapidly. But even in her distress, she was trying to position herself between Thomas and the 3 strangers, her maternal instincts overriding her own desperate need for help. "She's been taking care of him," Sarah said with wonder in her voice. "Look at this. She's been bringing him water in her mouth. There are wet marks around his lips. And look at these small prey remains. She's been feeding him." Jackson stared at the scene before him, his estranged father being protected by a wild animal who was risking her own life and the lives of her unborn cubs to keep him alive. The irony was bitter and beautiful at the same time. "Her mate's dead," Thomas said weakly. "Poachers got him 3 weeks ago. Been documenting it. Got photos of the whole operation. She's got nobody else now except you," Jackson finished. "Been studying her family for months," Thomas continued, his voice fading in and out. "Part of a documentary project about wildlife resilience. But when she lost her mate, she kind of adopted me, like I adopted her." Sarah was working frantically to assess both Thomas and Ayanna. "Jackson, we've got a serious problem. Your father's leg is badly crushed, possible internal bleeding, and he's severely dehydrated. But Ayanna's in active labor and there are complications. I can't treat them both adequately with what I have here." Mike had been trying different angles to move the boulder. "This rock's not budging without heavy equipment. We need a winch, maybe explosives." "I'm talking major rescue operation." Jackson looked around the narrow ravine, calculating distances and time. The canyon walls rose 40 feet on either side, too steep to climb with an injured man. The only way out was the treacherous path they'd taken down, and that would be impossible with Thomas in his current condition. "How long before the rescue team can get equipment down here?" Jackson asked. "Assuming we can get word to them, and assuming they can organize that kind of operation, minimum 12 hours, Mike replied. "More likely 18 to 24. "He doesn't have that long," Sarah said bluntly. "Neither does Ayanna." Thomas reached up with a trembling hand and grasped Jackson's wrist. "Son, listen to me. Take Ayanna and get out of here. Don't let my mistakes cost any more lives." "Like hell," Jackson said fiercely. "I'm not losing you again." "You never lost me," Thomas whispered. "I lost myself. Lost my way trying to find some spiritual answer to being a coward. Spent 23 years in the mountains learning what I should have known all along, that family is the only spirit that matters. Ayanna made a sound then, a low, mewling cry that seemed to encompass all the pain and fear and determination in the world. Jackson looked at the small creature who'd somehow orchestrated this reunion, who'd crossed impossible distances while carrying new life to save the old man who'd become her unlikely family. "Sarah," Jackson said quietly, "what do you need from me?" "I need you to choose," she replied, not looking up from her patients. "I can stabilize one of them long enough for a rescue attempt, but not both. The equipment, the supplies, the time, I have to choose." The weight of the decision settled on Jackson's shoulders like a lead blanket. Save his father, the man who'd abandoned him but who'd also taught him everything about being strong and loyal and true to the land. Or save Ayanna, the wild creature who'd shown more loyalty and sacrifice than most humans ever managed. "There's a third option," Thomas said, his voice gaining strength from somewhere deep inside. "You save her, son. She's got 3 lives inside her, maybe 4. Do the math." Jackson looked into his father's eyes and saw something there he'd never seen before. Absolute peace. For the first time in 23 years, Thomas Walking Bear looked like a man who'd found his purpose. "Dad." "I'm proud of you, Jackson," Thomas said. "Proud of the man you became despite having me for a father. Now prove I raised you right. Save the family that matters most." The storm arrived like an answer to a prayer Jackson hadn't known he was praying. Dark clouds rolled over the canyon rim just as Sarah finished stabilizing both Thomas and Ayanna with her limited supplies, and the first fat raindrops began spattering the limestone walls. Within minutes, what had been a gentle shower became a driving downpour that echoed through the ravine like thunder. "Flash flood!" Mike shouted over the rising noise. "We've got maybe 20 minutes before this whole canyon fills up." Jackson felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with crisis situations, the same focused calm that had carried him through 20 years of dangerous police work. But this time it was different. This time it was personal in ways that cut deeper than duty or training. "Sarah, how mobile are they?" he called out, water already streaming down his face. "Ayanna's between contractions right now, but she can't walk far. Your father—" Sarah shook her head grimly. "I've got his leg splinted and gave him what pain medication I had, but moving him is going to be agony." Thomas tried to push himself up on his elbows, his face gray with pain but determined. "Son, there's something you need to know about this canyon. When I was documenting the poaching operation, I found their base camp about half a mile downstream. There's a cave system there, high enough to be safe from flooding." "Poachers?" Jackson's cop instincts kicked into high gear even as he helped his father sit up straighter. "Organized operation," Thomas gasped, pausing as a wave of pain washed over him. "Been taking bobcats, mountain lions, anything they can sell to exotic pet traders. That's how Ayanna's mate died, caught in one of their snares." The water level in the ravine was rising visibly now, and Jackson could hear the roar of the approaching flood echoing off the canyon walls. They had minutes, not hours, to get everyone to safety. "Mike, can you carry Ayanna?" Jackson asked, already positioning himself to help his father. "What about the cubs?" Sarah protested. "She's too close to giving birth to be moved." "Better born in a cave than drowned in a flash flood," Jackson replied grimly, sliding his arms under Thomas's shoulders. "Dad, this is going to hurt like hell." Thomas nodded, setting his jaw. "Been hurting for 23 years, son. This is just a different kind of pain." The journey to the cave was a nightmare of mud, rushing water, and desperation. Jackson half carried, half dragged his father through the rising flood, while Mike cradled Ayanna in his arms like a child, the pregnant Bobcat too exhausted to struggle. Sarah brought up the rear, carrying as much medical equipment as she could manage while navigating the treacherous terrain. The water was knee-deep and rising fast when they reached the area Thomas had described. Jackson could see why the poachers had chosen this spot, a series of natural caves carved into the canyon wall, high enough above the flood line to provide shelter, but with multiple escape routes. "There," Thomas pointed with a shaking hand. "The big opening about 20 feet up. That's where they've been operating out of." Jackson looked at the cave entrance and felt his heart sink. Getting 3 injured beings up that limestone face in a flash flood would be impossible under normal circumstances. But as he watched, Ayanna suddenly lifted her head from Mike's arms and made a sound, not the desperate crying they'd heard before, but something different, almost like she was calling to someone. From the cave opening above them came an answering call, and Jackson's blood ran cold. They weren't alone. "Well, well," a gravelly voice echoed down from the cave. "Look what the flood washed in. If it ain't the old man who's been causing us so much trouble." 3 figures appeared at the cave entrance, silhouetted against the dim light from within. Jackson could see they were armed, and from their casual posture they felt very much in control of the situation. "You boys picked a hell of a day for a rescue mission," the leader called down. "But I'm afraid visiting hours are over." Jackson's hand moved instinctively toward his sidearm, but Mike caught his wrist. 3 against 1, Mike whispered, "and we've got civilians to protect." The water was rising faster now, already up to their waists and showing no signs of slowing. In another few minutes they'd all be swept away regardless of what the poachers decided to do. "Listen," Jackson called up to the cave. "We're not here about your operation. We just need shelter from the flood. Everyone walks away, no questions asked." Harsh laughter echoed down from above. "You think we're stupid, cop? That old man's been documenting everything we do, got photos, video, probably GPS coordinates of every trap we've set. You ain't walking away from nothing." Thomas struggled to speak, his voice barely audible over the rushing water. "Jackson, camera case, waterproof, all the evidence." Jackson suddenly understood. His father hadn't just been documenting Bobcat behavior, he'd been building a case against these poachers. The camera equipment back at the campsite contained evidence that could shut down their entire operation. "The old man dies here," the leader shouted down, "along with anyone stupid enough to try and help him. That wildcat, too. She's been nothing but trouble since we took her mate." Ayanna made another sound then, a low growl that seemed to come from deep in her chest. Even exhausted and in labor, she was trying to protect the humans who'd become her unlikely family. The water was chest-deep now, and Jackson could feel the current trying to pull them downstream. They had seconds to act before the flood swept them all away. "Mike," Jackson said quietly, "when I give the signal, get them both to those rocks on the left. There's an overhang that might give you cover." "What about you?" Jackson looked up at the cave entrance where 3 armed men held their lives in their hands, then down at his father and the brave little Bobcat who'd brought them all together. Sometimes being a cop meant making impossible choices. Sometimes being a son meant the same thing. "I'm going to do what Dad taught me 23 years ago," Jackson said, checking his weapon. "I'm going to protect my family." The floodwaters reached his shoulders just as the first shot rang out from above, and Jackson dove forward into the churning chaos, leaving behind the 2 most important lives he'd ever been responsible for protecting. The flash flood hit like a freight train, turning the narrow canyon into a churning maelstrom of mud, debris, and death. Jackson disappeared beneath the brown water just as more gunfire erupted from the cave above, muzzle flashes lighting up the limestone walls like deadly fireworks. Mike dragged Thomas and Ayanna toward the rocky overhang Jackson had indicated, fighting against a current that seemed determined to tear them all apart. The water was over his head now, and he could barely keep the unconscious Thomas's face above the surface, while Ayanna clung to his shoulder with claws that cut through his uniform shirt. "Where's Jackson?" Sarah screamed over the roar of the flood, her medical bag swept away in the churning water. Mike didn't answer because he didn't know. The last he'd seen of Jackson was the officer's dark head disappearing beneath the surface, swimming hard toward the base of the cliff where the poachers had their stronghold. Whether Jackson had made it to cover or been swept downstream was anyone's guess. Above them, the gunfire had stopped, replaced by angry shouting. The poachers were arguing among themselves, their voices barely audible over the flood's roar. "He's got to be dead," one of them yelled. "Nobody survives that current." "Yeah, well, the old man's still breathing down there, and that bobcat's worth $5,000 to the right buyer," the leader responded. "Soon as this water goes down, we finish what we started." Thomas stirred in Mike's arms, consciousness returning as cold water shocked his system. "Jackson," he gasped, trying to look around. "Where's my boy?" "He went after the shooters," Mike said grimly, struggling to keep them all anchored against the rocks. "Haven't seen him since?" Thomas closed his eyes, and Mike saw 23 years of regret wash over the old man's face. "Always was too brave for his own good," Thomas whispered. "Gets that from his mother." Ayanna suddenly tensed in Mike's grip, her body racked by a contraction that seemed to go on forever. Sarah fought her way closer through the swirling water, her hands immediately moving to examine the laboring bobcat. "She's crowning," Sarah announced, fear and wonder mixing in her voice. "The stress of the flood is accelerating everything. These cubs are coming whether we're ready or not." "Here. Now?" Mike couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Life doesn't wait for convenient timing," Thomas said weakly. And despite everything, there was a smile in his voice. "Trust me, I learned that lesson the hard way." The water level was starting to recede, but slowly, and they were still trapped on a narrow ledge with 3 armed men above them and a bobcat in active labor. Sarah did what she could with no equipment and minimal space, while Mike tried to position his body to shield them from the cave entrance. That's when they heard it. The sound of someone climbing up the wet limestone, metal scraping against stone. Jackson's voice echoed off the canyon walls, closer than it should have been. "You boys having a party up there without me?" Gunfire erupted again, but this time it was aimed away from the ledge where Mike and the others huddled. Jackson had somehow made it to the base of the cliff and was climbing up from a different angle, using the noise of the flood to mask his approach. "There's 3 of them, Jackson," Mike shouted as loud as he could. "All armed." "Thanks for the heads up, partner." Jackson's voice came from somewhere to their right now, definitely closer to the cave entrance. "Now keep your heads down." What followed was the kind of gunfight that usually only happened in movies. Jackson had the advantage of surprise and high ground training from his military days, but the poachers had superior numbers and knowledge of the cave system. The echoing gunshots made it impossible to tell who was winning until suddenly everything went quiet. "Jackson," Mike called out. "Jackson, you okay up there?" Silence stretched for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Then, finally, Jackson's voice drifted down from the cave entrance. "Yeah, I'm okay. But we're going to need that medical equipment Sarah brought. One of these idiots is bleeding pretty bad." Thomas struggled to sit up straighter. "What about the other 2? "Decided they didn't want to stick around for the arrest," Jackson replied. "Amazing how fast poachers can run when they're not the ones with the guns." Sarah looked up from where she was helping Ayanna through another contraction. "Jackson, I need you down here. She's having complications." Jackson's descent from the cave was much faster than his climb-up had been, accomplished with a rope he'd found in the poacher's equipment. He dropped onto the ledge just as Ayanna gave birth to the first cub, a tiny, mewling creature barely larger than Jackson's thumb. "Jesus," Jackson breathed, watching Sarah work to clear the newborn's airways. "She actually did it." "She's not done yet," Sarah said, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. I can feel at least 2 more. And Jackson, look at your father." Thomas had gone very pale, his breathing shallow and rapid. The stress of the flood and the gunfight had taken what little strength he had left. Jackson knelt beside him, taking the old man's hand. "Dad, stay with me. You've got grandcubs to meet." Thomas managed a weak laugh. "Grandcubs? Your mother would have gotten a kick out of that." His grip tightened on Jackson's hand. "Son, I need to tell you something while I still can." "Save your strength, Dad. The rescue team will be here soon." "No, listen to me." Thomas's voice gained urgency. "I didn't leave because I didn't love you. I left because I loved you too much to stay and watch myself become a burden. Early-stage dementia, the doctor said. Figured it was better to disappear than to slowly forget who you were." Jackson felt his world shift beneath him. "Dementia? Dad, why didn't you tell me?" "Because you were 25 and about to be a father yourself. Because I was a coward who thought running away was protecting you." Thomas coughed, and Jackson saw blood on his lips. "Took me 23 years to realize that love isn't about protecting people from pain. It's about being there when the pain comes anyway." Ayanna gave birth to the second cub just as Thomas finished speaking, as if the universe was underlining his point about the continuity of life. Sarah worked frantically to revive the tiny creature while the first cub nuzzled against its mother's belly. "2 down, 1 to go," Sarah announced. "But Jackson, we need to get them all to a veterinary hospital soon. And your father needs immediate medical attention." As if summoned by her words, the sound of helicopters echoed through the canyon. The rescue team had finally arrived, brought by Mike's earlier radio calls before they'd lost signal in the flood. "About damn time," Mike muttered, but there was relief in his voice. Jackson looked at his father, at the newborn Bobcat cubs, at the flood-damaged canyon that had somehow brought them all together. 23 years of anger and abandonment had led to this moment, a moment where love had triumphed over fear, where sacrifice had meaning, where family was defined not by blood but by the willingness to risk everything for each other. "Dad," Jackson said quietly, "when you get better, I want you to come home. I want you to meet your daughter-in-law. Yeah, Maria and I are talking again. And I want you to help me raise these cubs if Sarah thinks that's possible." Thomas smiled, tears cutting tracks through the mud on his cheeks. "Nothing I'd like better, son. Nothing in the world." The third cub was born as the rescue helicopter touched down on the canyon rim above them, and Jackson could have sworn he heard his father whisper a prayer of thanksgiving in the old language, words Jackson hadn't heard since he was a child. Words that somehow felt like coming home. The helicopter evacuation was a chaos of rotor wash, shouting medics, and desperate improvisation. Thomas was airlifted first, his condition too critical to wait, while Jackson stayed behind with Ayanna and her 3 newborn cubs. Sarah worked frantically to stabilize the Bobcat family in a makeshift shelter they'd created from emergency blankets and medical supplies. "She's hemorrhaging," Sarah announced grimly, her hands bloody from the emergency birth. "Without proper surgical facilities, I'm not sure I can stop the bleeding." Jackson knelt beside Ayanna, watching the exhausted mother try to nurse her cubs with what little strength she had left. The irony wasn't lost on him. After everything they'd been through, after surviving poachers and flash floods and gunfights, they might still lose her to complications from giving birth. "What do you need?" Jackson asked. "A miracle," Sarah replied honestly, "or a veterinary surgical suite. And we need it in the next hour." The second helicopter arrived as the sun began its descent toward the western canyon rim. But instead of more rescue personnel, 2 men in expensive suits climbed out, followed by a team of what looked like federal agents. "Officer Crow Feather?" The older of the 2 men approached, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to being obeyed. "I'm Agent Harrison, FBI. This is Agent Martinez from Fish and Wildlife Service. We understand you've uncovered a significant wildlife trafficking operation. Jackson looked up from where he was helping Sarah monitor Ayanna's condition. Right now, Agent Harrison, I'm more concerned with keeping a dying animal alive than I am with your investigation. I understand your priorities, officer, Harrison said, his tone surprisingly sympathetic. But what you've stumbled onto here is much bigger than just local poaching. This operation has connections to international wildlife trafficking rings worth millions of dollars. Agent Martinez stepped forward, his dark eyes focused on the camera equipment Mike had retrieved from the poacher's cave. Your father's documentation could help us shut down networks that span 3 countries. The evidence he gathered, it's the break we've been waiting for. Sarah looked up from her patient, exhaustion and frustration clear on her face. That's wonderful for your investigation, but it doesn't help me save these lives. I need surgical equipment, blood products, antibiotics, things you can't get in the middle of a canyon. Actually, Martinez said quietly, we might be able to help with that. The FBI has a mobile veterinary unit about an hour out. We use it for cases involving endangered species evidence. If you can keep her stable that long. Jackson felt something shift in his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Real, honest hope that didn't depend on him being perfect or never making mistakes or somehow earning redemption through suffering. Do it, Jackson said. Get your unit here. The next hour was the longest of Jackson's life. Ayanna's condition deteriorated steadily, her breathing becoming shallow and rapid. 2 of the cubs seemed healthy and strong, but the third, the smallest one, was struggling to nurse and showed signs of distress. Sarah did everything she could with limited resources, but Jackson could see the defeat creeping into her eyes. They were watching this brave little mother die after everything she'd sacrificed to save Thomas and bring her family into the world. That's when Ayanna did something that broke Jackson's heart and put it back together at the same time. With tremendous effort, she lifted her head and looked directly at him. Those amber eyes held the same intelligence and determination they'd shown on the highway, but now they carried something else. Trust. And she was entrusting her cubs to him. I see you, girl, Jackson whispered, gently stroking her head. I see what you're asking me to do. She made a soft sound, almost like a purr, and then focused all her remaining energy on cleaning and nursing her babies. Jackson understood. She was saying goodbye. The FBI's mobile veterinary unit arrived just as Ayanna's breathing became critically shallow. The vehicle was like something out of a science fiction movie. A fully equipped surgical suite on wheels, complete with anesthesia equipment, blood bank capabilities, and monitoring systems that belonged in a major hospital. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the FBI's chief veterinary forensics expert, took one look at Ayanna and immediately began barking orders to her team. Within minutes, they had the Bobcat on a surgical table with IV lines running and monitors showing her vital signs. She's lost a lot of blood, Dr. Vasquez announced, her hands moving with surgical precision. But she's strong. Stronger than she has any right to be after what she's been through. Jackson stood back and watched the controlled chaos of the surgical team, feeling helpless and amazed at the same time. These federal agents weren't just here for evidence. They genuinely cared about saving Ayanna's life. Officer Crowfeather, Agent Harrison said quietly, approaching Jackson while the surgery continued. Your father's condition has stabilized at the hospital. He's asking for you. I'm not leaving until I know she's going to make it, Jackson replied, not taking his eyes off the surgical table. I understand, but there's something else you need to know. The poaching operation your father documented, it's connected to the death of his son-in-law in a car accident 2 years ago. Jackson's blood went cold. What are you talking about? Martinez pulled out a tablet, showing Jackson a series of photographs. Your father's investigation revealed that Danny Crow Feather was killed because he'd accidentally photographed one of their trafficking operations during a school field trip. They staged the hit and run to silence him. The world tilted sideways around Jackson. Danny hadn't died because Jackson was working late. Danny had died because he'd seen something he shouldn't have, and murderers had decided an innocent 16-year-old boy was a threat. That's why your father kept investigating, Harrison continued. He knew his grandson's death wasn't an accident, and he was building a case to prove it. Ayanna's mate was killed when he got too close to their evidence. Jackson felt 23 years of guilt and self-blame begin to crack and crumble. His son hadn't died because he was a bad father. Danny had died because he was a good kid who'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time, and evil men had decided to murder him for it. We can prove it now, Martinez said. Your father's documentation, combined with what we found in that cave, gives us everything we need to prosecute not just the poachers, but the people who ordered your son's death. On the surgical table, Ayanna's monitors showed her vital signs stabilizing. Dr. Vasquez looked up from her work, a smile visible even behind her surgical mask. She's going to make it, the veterinarian announced. All 3 cubs are healthy. This little family is going to survive. Jackson closed his eyes and felt tears he'd been holding back for 2 years finally break free. Danny's death hadn't been his fault. Thomas's abandonment hadn't been about not loving his family. And somehow, a pregnant bobcat had orchestrated the healing of wounds that had seemed too deep to ever mend. Agent Harrison, Jackson said, his voice thick with emotion, I want to be part of this investigation. I want to help you get the bastards who killed my son. We were hoping you'd say that, Harrison replied. Because bringing down this network is going to take someone who understands what they've cost families like yours. Jackson looked at Ayanna, now breathing peacefully under anesthesia, her 3 cubs nestled safely in an incubator beside her. Tomorrow, they would all wake up in a world where justice was possible, where love could triumph over evil, where a father and son could find their way back to each other after 23 years of walking in opposite directions. Dad always said the spirits would guide us back together when the time was right, Jackson murmured, watching the cubs sleep. Guess they sent us a bobcat to show us the way home. 6 months later, Jackson stood in the sprawling visitor center of the Thomas Walking Bear Wildlife Sanctuary, watching his father demonstrate traditional Cherokee animal tracking techniques to a group of wide-eyed elementary school children. The old man's hair was completely silver now, and he walked with a slight limp from his canyon injuries. But his eyes sparkled with the same intelligence and passion Jackson remembered from his own childhood. Now who can tell me what this track tells us about the bobcat who made it? Thomas asked, pointing to a plaster cast display. A little girl with pigtails raised her hand eagerly. She was pregnant. You can tell because her paws spread wider to carry the extra weight. Very good, Sarah, Thomas beamed. And what else? She was walking slow because she was tired, a boy called out. My mom walked like that when she was pregnant with my baby sister. Thomas chuckled, the sound filling Jackson with warmth. Exactly right, Michael. This mama bobcat was tired, but she was also very determined. She had somewhere important to go. Jackson smiled, remembering that desperate day on Highway 287 that had changed all their lives. The plaster cast the children were studying had been made from Ayanna's actual tracks, found preserved in dried mud at the original campsite. The sound of soft paws on the polished concrete floor announced Ayanna's arrival. She padded into the visitor center with the confidence of someone who knew she belonged, her 3 cubs, now healthy 6-month-old adolescents, following in a loose line behind her. The children gasped with delight as the bobcat family approached. "And here's the famous lady herself," Thomas announced, his voice filled with affection. "Ayanna, come say hello to our guests." Ayanna approached the group calmly, allowing the children to observe her from a respectful distance. She'd never be fully domesticated, but the trauma of losing her mate and nearly dying in childbirth had bonded her to the humans who'd saved her life in ways that defied normal wildlife behavior. "Mr. Walking Bear," one of the children asked, "why doesn't she live in the wild anymore?" Thomas knelt down to the child's level, his weathered hands resting on his knees. "Well, sometimes life gives us experiences that change us. Ayanna learned that humans could be her family too, and we learned that family doesn't always look the way we expect it to." Jackson felt a familiar tightness in his throat. The sanctuary had been Thomas's idea, funded by a combination of federal grants, private donations, and the substantial reward money from helping to dismantle the international wildlife trafficking ring. But more than that, it had become a symbol of second chances and unconventional families. "Officer Jackson," one of the children called out, recognizing him in his civilian clothes. "Are you going to tell us about catching the bad guys?" Jackson laughed, walking over to join the group. "Maybe next time, buddy. Today's about learning to respect our wildlife neighbors." As the children continued their tour with Thomas, Jackson found himself alone with Ayanna and her cubs. The largest of the three, a male they'd named Spirit, approached him with the fearless curiosity of youth. Jackson remained perfectly still as the young bobcat sniffed his boots, eventually deciding he was safe enough to ignore. "Hard to believe it's only been 6 months," a familiar voice said behind him. Jackson turned to see Sarah Thundercloud approaching, a clipboard in her hands and a smile on her face. As the sanctuary's head veterinarian, she'd been instrumental in creating the specialized care protocols that allowed Ayanna's family to thrive in their unique situation. "Feels like a lifetime," Jackson agreed. "How are they doing health-wise?" "Perfect," Sarah replied, making notes on her clipboard. "Ayanna's fully recovered from the birth complications, and the cubs are hitting all their developmental milestones. But Jackson, we need to talk about their future." Jackson felt his stomach tighten. "What do you mean?" "The cubs are approaching the age where they'd naturally disperse in the wild. Spirit especially is showing signs of wanting more territory, more independence. We have to decide soon whether to try reintroducing them to wild populations or keep them here as educational ambassadors like their mother." The thought of losing the cubs sent an unexpected pang through Jackson's chest. Over the past 6 months, these animals had become family in ways he'd never imagined possible. But he also knew that keeping wild animals captive just because humans had grown attached to them wasn't fair to the animals. "What does Dad think?" Jackson asked. "He agrees with me that the cubs should have the choice," Sarah replied. "We've been working on a gradual release program. They'd stay on sanctuary property but have access to increasingly larger wild territories. If they choose to leave, they can. If they choose to stay, they can do that too." Jackson nodded, understanding the wisdom in the approach even as his heart rebelled against it. "And Ayanna? She's different. Her bond with humans, especially with your father, is too strong for her to survive in the wild. She's chosen her family, and we're it." As if summoned by their conversation, Thomas appeared in the doorway, having finished with the school group. At 72, he moved more slowly than he had 6 months ago, but the spark of purpose in his eyes burned brighter than ever. "How'd it go with the kids?" Jackson asked. "Wonderful," Thomas replied, settling into one of the visitor center's comfortable chairs. "That little Sarah asked if she could be a wildlife photographer when she grows up. Reminded me of someone else I know who used to have big dreams about working with animals." Jackson felt heat rise in his cheeks. "Dad, I was 8 years old when I said I wanted to be a bear tracker." Nothing wrong with childhood dreams, son. Sometimes they just take longer to come true than we expect. The truth was, Jackson had been thinking more and more about making a career change. The FBI had offered him a position with their wildlife crime unit, and the work felt more meaningful than traditional law enforcement. But it would mean leaving the Austin Police Department, leaving the familiar routine he'd built over 20 years. "There's something I need to tell you both," Jackson said, settling into a chair across from his father. "Agent Harrison called this morning. They've arrested the last of the trafficking network leadership. The trial starts next month." Thomas nodded gravely. "And Danny's case?" "Full justice. First-degree murder charges for everyone involved in the conspiracy. They won't see daylight for decades." Jackson's voice caught slightly. "Danny can finally rest in peace." Thomas reached over and squeezed his son's hand. "Your boy would be proud of what you've accomplished, Jackson. Proud of the lives you've saved, the family you've built, the healing you've allowed to happen." Ayanna approached them then, as if sensing the emotional weight of the conversation. She settled between Jackson and Thomas, her presence a calming reminder of the unexpected gifts that sometimes emerged from tragedy. "Dad," Jackson said quietly, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me." "Always, son. Are you happy? Really happy? After everything we've been through, everything we've lost and found again?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hand gently stroking Ayanna's fur. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady and sure. "Jackson, I spent 23 years running from the man I was afraid I'd become. I wasted decades of possible joy because I was so focused on avoiding pain. But sitting here now, watching you become the man I always hoped you'd be, seeing Ayanna's cubs learn to trust and love, knowing that your Danny's death has meaning because it helped us save other lives." Thomas smiled, tears glinting in his eyes. "Son, I'm happier than I've ever been in my life." The late afternoon sun streamed through the visitor center windows, casting long golden rectangles across the floor, where Ayanna's cubs played with the enrichment toys Sarah had scattered around. Outside, the sounds of the sanctuary carried on the warm Texas breeze, birds calling, water trickling in the creek, the distant laughter of families enjoying the nature trails. "You know what I learned from all this?" Jackson said, watching Spirit pounce on his sister in a mock hunt. "Family isn't about who shares your blood. It's about who shows up when everything falls apart. It's about who risks everything to save you, even when you don't deserve it." Thomas nodded, understanding flowing between them like a river finding its course. "Took an old Bobcat to teach this old Cherokee what the ancestors had been trying to tell me all along, that love is the only spirit that really matters." As if in response to their words, Ayanna looked up at both men with those intelligent amber eyes that had started their journey 6 months ago on a busy highway. She made a soft sound, almost like a purr, and Jackson could swear she was telling them that some families are born, some are chosen, and some are guided together by forces larger than any of them could understand. "Come on," Thomas said, pushing himself up from his chair. "Let's go check on Maria and the new baby. Your wife said dinner would be ready at 6, and you know how she gets when we're late." Jackson laughed, the sound echoing off the visitor center walls. 6 months ago, he'd been a divorced, bitter man carrying 23 years of anger and guilt. Now he had his father back, his marriage restored, a new daughter gurgling in her crib, and an extended family that included 3 young bobcats and their remarkable mother. As they walked toward the parking lot, Ayanna and her cubs following like the world's most unusual pet parade, Jackson realized that sometimes the most important journeys begin with a single act of desperate love: a pregnant bobcat blocking traffic, a father willing to risk everything for redemption, A son learning that forgiveness was just another word for coming home. Daddy always said when God's creatures come calling, "You best listen," Jackson murmured, echoing the words that had started their adventure. Thomas smiled, wrapping an arm around his son's shoulders. "Smart man, your daddy. Sometimes it just takes a while to understand what they're trying to tell us. Sometimes the greatest lessons come from the smallest teachers." When Officer Jackson Crow Feather first saw that little bobcat blocking Highway 287, he never imagined she'd lead him back to the father who'd walked away 23 years earlier. Like so many of us who've reached our golden years, Jackson carried the weight of old wounds, abandonment, guilt over his son's death, a marriage that crumbled under the pressure of grief. But Ayanna, that brave little mama, showed him something profound. Family isn't just about blood, it's about showing up when everything falls apart. Through flash floods, gunfights, and life-or-death choices, a wild animal demonstrated the kind of loyalty and unconditional love that many humans struggle to give. Jackson discovered that his father hadn't left out of selfishness, but out of fear, the same fear that keeps many of us from reaching out to estranged loved ones. The story reminds us that it's never too late for second chances, that forgiveness can heal decades of pain, and that sometimes the most unexpected messengers bring us exactly what we need. In our later years, when time feels precious and relationships matter most, perhaps we all need to ask ourselves, who in our family needs our love, and what small act of courage might bring us back together? Discussion. Questions. Have you ever had an estranged family member you've wanted to reconnect with? What held you back? What's the most unexpected way life has taught you about forgiveness or second chances? Please share your thoughts and stories in the comments below. Your experiences might inspire someone else to take that brave first step toward healing.